The map on the wall showed the nightmare 60,000 Soviet troops crashing through the Fulda Gap, T-72s rolling west in spearhead formations, artillery saturating NATO positions from behind the border. This was the scenario that haunted NATO command for decades, the unstoppable tide of Warsaw-packed armor overwhelming Western Europe by sheer numbers. The simulation began at 04:00 hours. By 06:00, it should have been over on paper, at least. But something was off. The Red Army moved by the book. Mechanized columns in echelon formation. Massed artillery prep followed by deep thrusts. Forward observers guiding waves of armor. But the American side didn't counter conventionally. No massed defense. No static lines. No retreat then counterstrike gambit. Instead, surgical airstrikes rained down on logistics hubs. AH-64 Apaches danced at treetop height, crippling command vehicles. Precision-guided munitions targeted bridges and rail choke points. Then came long-range artillery strikes not at troops, but at fuel depots, engineers, and rear security. By hour 6, Soviet lead elements were deep but starving. Their fuel was gone, communications severed, reinforcements stalled behind craters and destroyed supply lines. The frontline tanks, designed to break through, now sat idle. At hour 10, the simulation was halted. A Soviet general slammed his fist on the table. This is not war. This is dismantling. He wasn't wrong. What had just unfolded wasn't the kind of warfare Soviet planners had drilled for 40 years. There was no grand clash of armor, no decisive artillery duels, no heroic stands at bridges. Instead, there was disintegration, a system collapsing in real time, precision by precision, strike by strike. And for the first time, they saw it. The Americans weren't preparing to win a battle of numbers. They were preparing to erase it. Because while Soviet doctrine assumed quantity had a quality of its own, American doctrine had learned to treat mass as a liability. What the simulation revealed wasn't just a gap in tactics, it was a chasm in worldviews. One side believed wars were won by weight, the other had learned to win by velocity. And the realization struck Moscow like a thunderclap. They were no longer in a race for firepower. They were in a race against irrelevance. Deep within the Soviet General Staff's war planning divisions, one assumption reigned supreme: mass wins wars. Since the Second World War, every Soviet military plan had followed a simple, brutal logic: overwhelm the enemy with more tanks, more artillery, more men. It had worked against the Wehrmacht. It had terrified NATO planners for decades. And it was written into every layer of Soviet doctrine. In the 1980s, the numbers seemed to confirm it. Along the Central European Front, the Warsaw Pact outnumbered NATO 3-1 in tanks, 4-1 in artillery, nearly double in manpower. The Red Army could lose divisions and still push forward. It could absorb airstrikes, take attrition, and keep going. The assumption was clear once the first salvos ended. The side with more firepower would win. This thinking shaped everything from unit composition to weapon design. Soviet tanks were fast and simple, designed to be built in thousands. Artillery doctrines emphasized saturation over precision. Infantry formations were dense, linear, and relentlessly reinforced. Every Soviet war game was built around these premises. Victory meant moving west, breaking NATO lines, seizing airfields, overrunning command centers. The planners assumed the battlefield would be dense, filled with targets, and driven by momentum. They expected NATO to try to slow them, not stop them, because NATO had fewer tanks, fewer shells, fewer men. And that meant NATO would be on the defensive always, except that's not what the Americans were building. As early as the late 1970s, Signals began to surface that the U.S. was shifting. A strange doctrine emerged, AirLand Battle. It didn't talk about holding lines. It didn't emphasize attrition. It focused on disruption, striking deep, paralyzing movement, collapsing formations without confronting them head-on. Soviet analysts read the words, saw the charts, but dismissed the concept. They saw it as propaganda, or worse, desperation, an inferior force clinging to theory. One colonel scoffed, "They are writing essays to cover up a lack of tanks." But it wasn't an essay. It was a blueprint. And every assumption that mass would overwhelm finesse was about to collapse. Because while the Soviets believed the battlefield would be about weight, the Americans were training for a battlefield of decision speed. And when the two doctrines finally met, the cost of that assumption would be measured not in theory, but in steel. Fire and ruin. Soviet military doctrine was built for conquest at scale. It envisioned warfare as a sequence of blows massive, pre-coordinated, top-down offensives aimed at cracking through NATO defenses and advancing relentlessly westward. It wasn't built to react, it was built to overwhelm. Every formation had its role. Artillery was to suppress, tanks were to breach, and motor rifle divisions were to flood through the gaps. The operations were scripted, layered, and tightly controlled. Orders flowed from high command to front-line units through rigid chains of command. Initiative was rarely rewarded. Improvisation discouraged. Victory depended on planning, synchronization, and above all volume. But that model was fraying. While Soviet planners clung to these rigid sequences, U.S. doctrine was being reshaped by a bitter post-Vietnam reality. American commanders knew they would never match the Warsaw Pact in numbers. So they rewrote the rulebook. AirLand Battle was born in 1982 not as a tactic, but as an operational mindset. It accepted the imbalance of mass and turned it against the attacker. How? By striking deep, not just forward. U.S. forces were no longer expected to hold a defensive line. Instead, they were trained to disrupt the sequence of Soviet operations, target supply lines, hit communications, ambush artillery staging areas, insert special forces behind the front, deploy long-range artillery not against enemy armor, but against fuel convoys, engineering units, and rear command posts. The doctrine assumed something revolutionary, that if you shattered the coherence of an offensive force, its timing, its logistics, its leadership, it no longer mattered how many tanks were rolling forward. They would be blind, starving, and unsupported. This concept terrified traditional Soviet thinkers because it was fast, fluid, and asymmetrical. It rewarded real-time decisions. It assumed that combat success came not from weight of fire, but from decision-making tempo. Worse still, the Americans were training for it. Their war games changed. Red flag evolved. Pilots were taught not to follow scripted missions, but to adapt dynamically to battlefield conditions. Artillery units drilled for rapid relocation and independent fires. Infantry learned to operate with minimal oversight. The battlefield was becoming something the Soviets didn't understand. Decentralized, agile, systemic, and that meant Soviet doctrine, with all its mass, was at risk not of being outgunned, but of being outmaneuvered by thought itself. The moment came in 1987 during Exercise Reforger, the largest NATO war simulation of the decade. Tens of thousands of U.S., British, and West German troops were deployed across the plains of Western Europe. Soviet observers, invited under mutual verification agreements, watched closely. The scenario was blunt, a Warsaw Pact invasion. Soviet-style forces would smash through Central Europe, pushing NATO back. The Red Army's playbook: massed armor, saturation artillery, Rapid exploitation was in full display, even if simulated, and NATO was expected to absorb the blow, bleed, then counterstrike in desperation. Except that didn't happen. The Blue Force didn't mass for defense. They didn't dig in along fixed lines. They didn't wait to be hit. Instead, they attacked first not at the spearhead, but at the spine. U.S. Apache helicopters swept in from unexpected angles, decimating rear echelon convoys. M270 MLRS units launched deep strikes against supply nodes. Air Force squadrons didn't focus on enemy tanks. They obliterated bridges, fuel dumps, and communications relays, and the front line. It kept moving, but blindly, faster than its support, louder than its logistics, hungrier by the hour. By the end of day 2, entire Red Force brigades were stalled mid-advance, not destroyed, not encircled, just paralyzed. Their supplies had vanished. Their radios went silent. Their artillery support was misdirected, their flanks exposed. The simulation ended in a result no Soviet officer could have predicted. The offensive had collapsed without a single major engagement. One Soviet general, according to a U.S. after-action report, leaned back from the observation room and muttered, "This is not combat. This is amputation." What he saw was terrifying. The Americans hadn't confronted the Soviet template, they had deleted it. Not by meeting it head-on, but by bypassing it entirely. This wasn't the slow, grinding, mutually destructive war the Soviets had prepared for. This was something else. Networked fires, fluid maneuver, lethal tempo, and worst of all, the Americans were getting faster. Their pilots no longer needed GCI vectors, they had AWACS. Their artillery didn't wait for HQ orders, they responded to real-time sensors. Their tank units didn't deploy en masse, they struck, displaced, and struck again. For Soviet observers, the impossible had occurred. The side with fewer troops, fewer guns, and fewer tanks had not only survived, it had dismantled an entire offensive in real time, without a decisive battle, without a breakthrough, just by thinking faster. And that changed everything. The reports came in from Germany, and they were unsettling. Soviet liaison officers attached to the Reforger wargame debriefs used muted language phrases like unexpected maneuverability and dispersed coordination. But behind closed doors, they were shaken. The Americans hadn't fought conventionally. They hadn't relied on mass. They hadn't even played by the rules of physics the Soviet war machine had trained against. Instead, NATO had operated like a neural network, fast, adaptive, untethered by traditional doctrine. And yet, when the files reached Moscow, the response was denial. High Command dismissed the findings as scenario bias. "It's only a simulation," scoffed Marshal Ogarkov. "In real war, numbers matter." Others suggested that NATO had cheated the war game to score political points or impress West German politicians. The assumption was clear: no real military force could abandon structured command hierarchies and still remain coordinated. The Soviet Union had spent decades proving that centralized control worked. It was how they crushed Berlin, how they held the Eastern Bloc, how they planned to seize Europe in 72 hours. But the Americans had broken the script. They hadn't defended ground, they had shattered tempo. They hadn't matched firepower, they had disrupted command. They hadn't won the battle, they had unwritten it. Yet in Moscow's war rooms, the doctrine was sacred. The idea that small, flexible units could operate semi-independently, coordinating in real time via air and satellite, bordered on fantasy. Soviet logistics couldn't support it. Their communications infrastructure couldn't maintain it. Their culture rejected it. So, they rationalized. Maybe this new AirLand battle was a bluff. Maybe NATO knew it couldn't win head-on, so it invented a theory, something elegant on paper, but hollow in practice. That was the comfort. Because if it wasn't a bluff, if it was real, then the entire Soviet model was at risk. Every tank battalion, every layered defense grid, every doctrine about saturation, sequencing, and mass shock. One officer in the GRU reportedly warned, if they can fight without weight, we lose our advantage before the first shell is fired. His warning was ignored. The party line held the Americans had good propaganda and expensive toys, but the Red Army had history, steel, and numbers. And in 1987, that still felt like enough. But beneath that confidence, cracks were forming, because even the most loyal Soviet planners couldn't unsee the truth. What happened in Reforger wasn't fiction. It was a preview. And the real storm hadn't even begun. As troubling reports from NATO exercises continued to filter into Soviet intelligence briefings, Moscow reached for a more comfortable explanation, one that preserved their faith in mass and doctrine. They blamed the technology. To Soviet generals, the answer was obvious. American hardware. The F-15, the M1 Abrams, the AH-64 Apache. These weren't just weapons, they were icons of Western over-engineering, each one packed with advanced optics, sensors, and electronic countermeasures. In war game after war game, NATO's success was chalked up to these platforms. We are losing to machines. One general reportedly spat. The Red Army didn't fear the doctrine, it feared the gear. And so began a flurry of countermeasures. The MiG-29 and Su-27 were pushed into mass production, aiming to challenge the F-15 in air superiority. The T-80 tank was hailed as a response to the Abrams. SAM networks were expanded with new radar frequencies to counter low-flying helicopters. But it didn't work. Even when Soviet forces were given theoretical parity in hardware, simulated F-15 clones, Abrams matching armor, or equal sensor ranges, the outcome of engagements remained the same. NATO didn't win because of better tools. They won because of how they used them. American pilots didn't just rely on the F-15 speed. They used AWACS vectors to avoid ever being seen. Used tanks didn't just shoot farther. They coordinated through battlefield networks to preempt threats. Artillery didn't just fire faster. It was fed by live intelligence from drones, satellites, and forward observers acting with autonomy. The gear wasn't decisive. The system was, and in clinging to the theory of hardware supremacy, the Soviet leadership missed the deeper change. The Americans had built a doctrine where no single platform was vital because every unit operated as part of a seamless battlefield web. Precision replaced saturation. Coordination replaced brute force. Initiative replaced hierarchy. By the time Soviet strategists realized this, it was too late. They had poured billions into catching up in weapons while NATO had been refining integration. The wrong theory had blinded them. They had fought the enemy's steel and missed his software. And in the wars to come, it would cost them everything. When the hardware explanation collapsed, Soviet analysts scrambled for another theory, one that could explain NATO's accelerating dominance without admitting a doctrinal failure. They found it in the stars. The new belief American satellites were the real problem. The logic felt secure. With advanced space-based reconnaissance, the U.S. could see everything: supply convoys, troop movements, even command vehicles. If the Americans had that kind of omniscience, then no doctrine on Earth could counter it. And it was partly true. By the late 1980s, the U.S. had developed a vast network of satellites, Keyhole for imagery, Magnum for signals intelligence, DSP for missile warning. It gave them near real-time eyes on the battlefield, far beyond anything the Soviets could match. But what Soviet generals didn't understand was this. The satellites weren't the key. The speed of decision-making was, yes. American satellites could spot a column. But it was the Doctrine AirLand Battle that empowered a field commander to act on that information without waiting for orders. It was the network with AWACS, J-stars, TACnet that distributed data to the shooters in seconds. It was the training from Red Flag, from real-world missions that enabled soldiers, pilots, and gunners to respond dynamically. The Soviets saw information dominance as a centralized advantage, but the Americans had decentralized it, and that was the true revolution. Soviet commanders still had to wait for top-down approval. Their units operated in strict formations, decisions were delayed, risks avoided, and creativity crushed. Even if a Soviet satellite had spotted an enemy column, it wouldn't matter. The response would still come too late. Meanwhile, a U.S. artillery officer could get satellite coordinates, punch them into a fire control system, and launch within minutes without ever contacting Division HQ. It wasn't the satellites. It was the permission to act. That was the mistake Moscow made. They tried to match surveillance power when they should have restructured decision power. And so, while Soviet leaders poured resources into building better sensors and jamming NATO's eyes, they ignored the foundation, crumbling beneath them a system that could not adapt, a culture that could not decentralize, a doctrine that could not keep up. They believed war would be decided by what you could see. The Americans had already moved on. They were winning by how fast they could react. The seeds of collapse weren't hidden. They were right there in open-source journals, NATO military publications, even leaked doctrinal briefings. Soviet intelligence had access to much of it. But they made the most catastrophic mistake a spy agency can make. They read everything and understood nothing, beginning in the late 1970s. American military thinkers started publishing material that seemed, to Soviet eyes, like fiction. The U.S. Army's Field Manual, 100-5, described something surreal decentralized warfighting, simultaneous deep and close battles, commanders executing missions based on intent, not direct orders. To the GRU and military intelligence analysts, this wasn't a plan, it was desperation in prose. A facade to cover NATO's numerical inferiority. After all, what kind of army trusted lieutenants with battlefield decisions? What kind of doctrine assumed chaos was a strength? The Soviets cataloged the documents, filed the observations, analyzed the exercises, but they didn't believe. They thought they were watching a deception operation, a theatrical display designed to convince NATO populations that weakness was innovation. And so they missed the most important transformation of the post-Vietnam U.S. military. The Americans weren't inventing new tactics. They were deconstructing warfare. AirLand Battle wasn't just theory, it was an operating system, a way to stitch satellites, tanks, aircraft, and infantry into a single cognitive engine reacting in real time, flowing around mass, killing cohesion, and the GRU saw it too late. One internal analysis, finally declassified after the Cold War, admitted that while the U.S. was building precision doctrine for surgical effect, the Soviet Union was preparing for a different century. It read, grimly, they do not intend to win by strength. They intend to win by knowing first, striking first, and never being seen. That single line captured everything the Soviets had failed to grasp. In their obsession with counting tanks, analyzing missile ranges, and simulating breakthroughs, they missed the signal hiding in the data The battlefield had gone cognitive. In 1990, as the Gulf War loomed, Soviet analysts saw the deployment of J-stars and assumed it was just another AWACS. They didn't understand what it enabled real-time tracking of Iraqi armor, shared instantly with artillery, air, and ground units. And when Desert Storm began, it was too late. They weren't watching a war. They were watching the consequence of decades of misreading. The Cold War's most dangerous blind spot wasn't technological. It was the refusal to believe that the enemy had reinvented war. To Soviet planners, AirLand Battle had seemed like a bluff, but in execution, it was a machine of war unlike anything they'd ever faced, an invisible system that reached from the cockpit to space, from the platoon leader to orbiting satellites, and it moved faster than any doctrine built en masse could hope to react to. It wasn't just about firepower. It was about integration, at its core. AirLand Battle fused four principles: depth. The battlefield was no longer just the front line. Rear echelons, logistics, communications, and infrastructure were legitimate, high-priority targets. Agility U.S. units operated with initiative, reacting dynamically to fluid combat conditions instead of awaiting top-down orders. Synchronization air, land, and intelligence assets didn't act sequentially. They struck together, in time, and with cascading effects. Tempo victory wasn't just about doing more, it was about acting faster, paralyzing the enemy before they could think, much less respond. The practical results were staggering. An AH-64 Apache unit could locate, target, and destroy a Soviet tank column within minutes without exposing itself to counterattack. F-16s, guided by AWACS and J-stars, could strike targets selected less than 20 minutes earlier by a recon drone. M1 Abrams tanks could engage at ranges where return fire wasn't even possible. Artillery units received live feeds from scouts, satellites, and UAVs, turning the backfield into a kill zone. The whole system ran on information velocity, a continuous loop of sensing, deciding, and acting. And unlike Soviet command structures, which delayed action until orders arrived, the U.S. model trusted the edge. Lieutenants, pilots, artillery commanders each had the tools and the authority to act independently within a shared mission framework. One Soviet analyst, stunned by captured Gulf War footage, remarked, "They do not maneuver toward victory, they orchestrate it." Even the tools of war reflected the system. The AM-120 AMRAAM, the M270 MLRS, the J-stars aircraft, none were decisive alone, but together they allowed a kind of warfare that collapsed Soviet concepts. The battlefield was no longer a chessboard. It was a neural network. Soviet doctrine sought to mass forces at a point of decision. American doctrine eliminated that point before the decision could occur. Every tank destroyed before it reached range. Every unit isolated before it reached its objective. Every commander paralyzed before he could issue a counterorder. In red flag exercises and later in Iraq, this system was proven again and again, a seamless loop of intelligence, coordination, and lethal action. The U.S. didn't just fight faster, they fought preemptively, shaping the battlefield before the first shots were fired. It wasn't superior weapons, it wasn't superior numbers, it was the complete annihilation of the idea that numbers still mattered. And for Soviet generals who had built careers en masse on the promise of overwhelming force, it was nothing short of a doctrinal extinction event. When the air war over Iraq began in January 1991, it looked, at first glance, like the showdown the Soviets had anticipated for decades. The Iraqi military was heavily equipped with Soviet-designed hardware, 5,000 tanks, including over 1,000 T-72s. Dense SAM belts modeled after Soviet air defense grids. Doctrinal training mirroring Warsaw Pact operational flow. But what happened next wasn't a battle. It was disassembly. Within the first 48 hours, American stealth aircraft had already torn open the heart of Iraqi command and control. F-117 struck bunkers and radars the Iraqis never saw. E-3 AWACS and J-STARS hovered silently, feeding real-time data to aircraft, ground units, and missile batteries. The Iraqi Air Force, equipped with MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and even MiG-25s, barely got off the ground. Those that did were hunted. Some fled to Iran, others died without ever seeing their attacker. And on the ground, the massacre began. Use M1 Abrams tanks, operating in fluid formations. Engaged Iraqi T-72s at ranges up to 3,000 meters. Iraqi tanks rarely returned effective fire. In some sectors, entire brigades were wiped out before they had acquired targets. Apache helicopters slipped between radar gaps, launching Hellfire missiles into convoys. MLRS batteries showered retreat routes with submunitions. The Republican Guard, Saddam's elite armored force, was rendered combat ineffective within days. Soviet observers, allowed limited insight through indirect channels, were horrified. They weren't watching a clash of forces. They were witnessing the erasure of a military concept. Everything they had designed, built, and exported, the tactics, the training, the machines had been humiliated, not by superior numbers, not even by sheer technological advantage, but by a system that moved too fast to be touched. One Soviet general privately concluded, "Our weapons fought. Theirs coordinated. We built mass. They built momentum." The battlefield was never symmetrical. The Americans never gave the Iraqis a fair fight, because fairness, in war, is a myth. And in that asymmetric decimation, the Soviets saw their own reflection. What would happen if NATO had fought them? What if those F-117s had struck their missile bunkers? What if M1s had met T-80s in Poland? The Gulf War wasn't just a victory, it was a demonstration, a live broadcast of what happens when doctrine ossifies and the enemy evolves. And for Moscow, it was clear. In a real war, their numbers wouldn't just lose, they would become targets. In the aftermath of Desert Storm, the Soviet military command convened in crisis, not because the USSR had been directly involved, but because the results were undeniable. Every model they had trained under, every assumption about Western capabilities, had been shattered not in theory, but in fire and steel. A decade of ignoring AirLand Battle had caught up to them. The war in Iraq proved that numbers meant nothing against speed, coordination, and precision. More damningly, it proved that a military built on control, rigid, top-down authority was destined to be outpaced by one built on trust and decentralized initiative. This wasn't just a defeat on paper, it was a collapse of worldview. Marshal Yazov, the Soviet defense minister, was briefed on how quickly Iraqi forces had disintegrated under systems-based warfare. Analysts showed him the real-time data loops, the layered coordination between satellites, aircraft, and ground forces. It was incomprehensible to a system that still required written orders to fire artillery across zones. One stunned colonel remarked, "We prepared to fight formations. They erased formations before they appeared. For a regime obsessed with mass, this was the apocalypse." The realization hit with terrifying clarity. The Soviet model could no longer guarantee victory, not even survival. This began a chain reaction. Military doctrine was questioned. War colleges were thrown into chaos. Planners frantically sought to adapt, but the political system was too slow, too paranoid, too brittle to absorb change at that scale. AirLand Battle wasn't just a strategy, it was an evolution, and it had arrived before the Soviets could even adapt to the last war. Worse, the rot was ideological. The Soviet Union had always used military power as proof of the system's superiority, of the party's legitimacy. The Red Army was more than a fighting force. It was a symbol. But symbols can't bleed without consequences. Desert Storm exposed the truth to the world and to the Politburo. The West had moved on. The Soviets were preparing for 1945, while America was already fighting 2020. And so, behind the crumbling walls of the Kremlin, as the USSR spiraled toward its final days, a silent consensus took hold. They had lost the arms race, they had lost the battlefield, and worst of all, they had lost the future. Today, Russia still trains armored divisions, still deploys layered air defense grids, still believes in the value of massive artillery barrages, tank columns, and battlefield weight. But in the shadows of every exercise, every maneuver, one phantom remains, a ghost born not from missiles or tanks, but from doctrine, the ghost of AirLand Battle. Every time a Russian war planner draws up an offensive, there's a whisper of a system that dismantled mass with movement, that bypassed strength with speed, that replaced destruction with disruption. That whisper echoes through modern war zones, too. In Georgia, in 2008, Russian forces struggled with coordination and real-time response. In Ukraine, their artillery dominated until NATO provided precision strikes, shattered rear areas with information-fed efficiency. And in every drone strike, every satellite-guided HIMARS barrage, the same fear returns. What if we're still building numbers in a world that rewards tempo over total? What if our doctrine, hardened in steel and fire, is still vulnerable to ideas faster than bullets? The Soviet collapse wasn't sealed by one battle. It wasn't broken by one weapon. It was broken by a thought. What if you can't outnumber what you can't even see? That thought destroyed the credibility of Soviet military power. It collapsed the doctrine. And it haunts every army that still believes war is won by counting tanks. Because in the ruins of Soviet confidence lies a lesson carved into Cold War memory. In the end, it wasn't the missiles, it was the mindset.